Okay, great. And my name is Leo Masek. I'm the director of the Games' Arts Center, and this is Paul.
Hello, it's a pleasure having you here. I am the person who contacted you, the research talk coordinator.
Great. So whenever you are ready, let's please. So these talks, the rules for these talks is you'll have about 10 minutes to give your talk, but I won't cut you off, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of audience question and answering in response. So whenever you are ready, please take it away.
Yeah, good evening to everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for having us. Since time is short, I will immediately start. The next slide, please, Kai. In recent time in ancient history, there has been a huge interest into how antiquity is, as to how there's the reception of antiquity in popular culture. Think about movies like 300, Rise of an Empire, or Gladiator, or God forbid Gladiator 2. But also in heavy metal, which is a new focus of this kind of research, and especially there is an interest about games and how antiquity is staged in games. And the next slide, please. Assassin's Creed is of particular interest in this respect because it tells a contrafactual story. It highlights that it was created by a multicultural team of members of different religions and beliefs, and so on. So they don't want to hurt anybody's religious feelings with that, because at the end of the day, the story is highly religious. Next slide, please. There are two parts of Assassin's Creed which are situated in ancient times. So I'm sure that you are familiar with the story. It's the epic fight between Templars and assassins. Both are historical figures, but what we see in Assassin's Creed is totally contrafactual, in fact. And the first part was Origins, which is situated in Ptolemaic Egypt, which was a bit surprising. And the second part is situated in classic Greece, and it's called Odyssey. The games, at first view, are offering a very good reconstruction of the ancient worlds. They are highly immersive, and you can walk around in classical Athens. And if you ever have been to Athens and you know the classical topography, you can walk there, orienting the just as you are in Athens itself. So it's a good starting point. Next slide, please. Not at least because a lot of our students are gamers. The Let's Play was an idea of Kai, of course, but I was very enthusiastic at the first. In the moment he asked me, because I saw what my son did. You see here, it's a German influencer who had a Let's Play of 9 hours. So you can see how that works. And my son, when he hit a dead end in Assassin's Creed or in other video games, he used the Let's Play to solve his problems. So to sum up, Kyle, next slide, please. Since most of our students are gamers, they are highly motivated to study and to analyze Assassin's Creed and how classical Greece is staged there, and to compare this staging with the results of contemporary research. And so using AC as a point of departure leads to much more intensive learning than the traditional approach. And here I would give over to Kai.
I believe your microphone is muted right now, Kai.
Thank you so much for the advice. I will start with the section of our media didactical approach, because we conducted the project as a teaching project at the University of Kassel. And from the standpoint of media didactics, our teaching project followed an approach of digital game-based learning in the understanding of the US pedagogue Mark Pransky that had the goal to combine the epoch of the classical Greece, as Kai has mentioned, with the media life world of our students by using the game world of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This connection should call attention to the issue and increase the intrinsic motivation of our students. Assassin's Creed Odyssey situates the players at the centers of an authentic reconstruction of classical Greece and gives them the opportunity to experience this epoch by interacting with historical characters, for instance, Socrates at ancient places. Yes. Furthermore, the learners can participate in historical events, for example, the Battle of Amphipolis 422 before Christ. Here we can see the killing of the Spartan general Brasidas by the game's antagonist. By playing the game and being confronted with its topics, the students had to reflect the popular conceptions of history that the game represents. Taking the killing of Brasidas as an example, we can see that this scene follows specific conventions of the representation of violence being popular in the contemporary media culture and its reception of antiquity. These conventions had been popularized, as Kai has mentioned also, by famous motion pictures like 300 by Zack Snyder, for example. Our project seminar used the learning approach based on the situatedness of learners in a world, providing the opportunity to experience history, and combines it with the intention of increasing the digital literacies of the learners. Using the aforementioned Let's Analysis as course assessment, we want to enhance different media literacies concerning the reception and the critical reflection of the current media culture, as well as the production of media content. The focus on the production of media has been an important issue from the beginning of our project. The Let's Analyze is a hybrid of two different types of videos. Firstly, the Let's Play, which is a popular phenomenon in game culture. Let's Plays are created by recording digital gaming sessions and streaming them via Twitch or uploading them on YouTube. The Let's Plays has several subgenres encompassing esport, tutorials, or walkthroughs, and comedy. Secondly, the Let's Analyze is rooted in the tradition of the academic video essay that is quite popular in film studies and that has been developed to analyze audiovisual media. I'm simply sure you know some examples by Catherine Grant, for instance. Here we can see an example of the German film critic Marco Risch and his YouTube channel Nerd Culture. We use this channel to demonstrate the students the particular traits of video essays in general. It was challenging for our learners to get familiar with the Let's Analyze as a new kind of academic publication that is still in progress. They learned something about the content and shape of Let's Analyzes while participating in the configuration of this medium. Finally, the students realized how difficult it is to combine academic and entertainment media in the context of edutainment. The students represented their results in project groups every week, as well as the other project groups made suggestions to edit their Let's Analyzes. Before we could do this, we had to tell the learners the most important issues about the technical and the conceptual fundamentals of video production. We started our seminar with a technical introduction in different software programs like OBS Studio and on Elgato Capture Card for the capturing of the game sessions or DaVinci Resolve for video editing. Additionally, we provided self-learning units like tutorials and guides for the needed programs via our learning platform, in our case Moodle. We used freeware for our teaching project, allowing the project groups to work independent of each other. Our students could use several services of the Service Center Lehre of the University of Kassel, for example, a recording studio. Furthermore, they could lend hardware and ask the educational film department when they had special technical or conceptual questions. The technical introduction has been followed by a conceptual one, and as we talked about screenwriting or storyboarding. In this context, the narrative and the argumentative structure has been very important to support the screenwriting. The popular screenwriting model, the hero's journey, popularized by Christopher Vogler and originally created by the myth researcher Joseph Campbell, was used. Moreover, the application of this model had another advantage for our project seminar. We applied it for content analysis as well as for the reflection of the represented conceptions of history. In summary, it can be said that the Let's analyses are products and objects of the deconstruction and reconstruction of current conceptions of history in some way. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very, very much. All right, we have some time for some questions. If you're online, please feel invited to either just turn on your microphone and ask, totally chill. You can also put in any questions into the chat and I will read them aloud as well. So to start us off, are there any questions in the room or online?
Thank you so much for this really interesting and insightful talk. What I was wondering is, touching upon this intrinsic motivation from the students, I'm not sure whether there is some sort of gender component in this intrinsic motivations or pre-existing interest that maybe some students may have in relation to the games that they feel compelled to play with or they feel more engaged with, because maybe not all sort of students are engaged with these historical games. I mean, this is a totally uneducated guess, but do you have any insights on that?
Would you like?
Yeah, I can start. Gender is a very interesting issue in this context in several ways, because of course you're right. Genres like the action-adventure genres have a huge percentage of a male player playing the game, and gender is an issue that is a little bit difficult in the history of Assassin's Creed. And it's a first part of the series, and that was a very important point for us, where you have the ability to play or choose between two protagonists, between the gender of two protagonists. In the seminar, it was, I think, nearly 50-50 regarding the gender representation, I guess, but Kai may correct me.
No, you're perfectly right. And I taught the course a second time in a slightly different form. And you would be surprised how many female students are gamers. There have been also female students from other disciplines who participated in our seminar because they were so much interested in Assassin's Creed. So I think this bias, which one could think of, is not there anymore, at least in the group of our students, you know. And of course, that is not a statistical value. That's an impression I got from teaching these courses. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Carolyn asks, has this project been implemented in a school as a part of a curriculum, a general background?
Yes, the students could get their credits, like writing an essay, which they usually have to in history. And that was a new form of examination for them.
Mm-hmm. And kind of going off of that, kind of a question on that, what was the kind of department it was inside of? Was this like a history education course?
Yes.
Or, okay.
No, it's a study program, history. But you know, we have two different kinds of study programs. We have bachelor and master, like the rest of Europe, and we have a special study program for those becoming teachers, which is a specialty of Germany. It's called Städtel exam, and they have a slightly different program, but they have to learn about reception of history and so on, because they have to address pupils in their schools, and they have to get them where they come from, you know. So yeah, it was quite amazing experience to see all these groups of students working together on different problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have another question. Does anyone else have a question? Room?
Thank you. Sorry, I'm outside the camera here, but I was thinking about the idea that first of all, I'm no historian myself. I'm a game researcher person and from sociology, but the idea that I've gotten at some point was that in history, the value of doing an sort of an objective telling hasn't always existed. So the idea that there were previous historical tellings that weren't even aimed at that. So sort of like, was thinking, would it be interesting to sort of bridge the gap that these games are also historical tellings from a certain point of view, as were the histories that we already have inherited. So there's a sort of a similarity there. That's what I was thinking. Thanks.
Could I? Yeah, of course. History is always the interpretation of the past from the point of departure of the present. So there are a lot of similarities, and it's interesting to see that those who made Assassin's Creed are really sticking to what is written in our sources. They repeat the narrative structures and so on. Sometimes they go above and beyond. For instance, the leader of the cult in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, it's the wife of Pericles, and of course that is not backed up by any source. So you could also use later on, let's say 20 years, you could use Assassin's Creed Odyssey to analyze how ancient history was told in the 20s of the 21st century, you know. So there's a lot of structural similarity between those two.
Mm-hmm. We still have some time for questions. Carolyn, you brought up possibly having a follow-up. Would you like to ask?
Yes, I was. It was a question around how games can be integrated. Because I think the argument that games can be used to motivate students has been around for quite a long time. My understanding of the literature, which it's not really my field, but is actually there are massive practical difficulties with using games in classrooms or assessing as homework, including equity of access, including the possibility of getting very distracted away from learning objectives or teaching objectives, you know, like students going off and doing stuff that teachers don't really consider to be part of their course, quite understandably. And I'm struck that you haven't really raised any of these practical difficulties. So I was wondering how you managed to bypass them.
to be honest, there wasn't any difficulty. You know, it was astonishing. We didn't have to do much because the students were so enthusiastic. They were discussing among each other, even when the time of the course was over. So sometimes we had to kick them out of the room because the room was needed for other courses. This problem we did not have, at least in my view. Now, Kai, if you see it
I do
differently.
absolutely agree. And they invested a lot of time. They
Yeah.
invested more time than they get credit for. They had been really motivated, and this motivation also showed up in scenes when they were able to solve problems in corporations, talking about issues they had on, for example, technical issues or conceptual issues. How to, for the most students, they had to create a video essay for the first time in their life. And so it had been a little bit difficult to combine different modes of representation. For example, the pictures and the sound, and to bring moving images and sound together. And it was very fascinating to observe the students when they discussed and solved the problems in groups and were solving problems of other groups with in a very enthusiastic manner. That was really great, and we haven't expected that.
Cool. All right, and that is all of our time for that talk. So thank you so much for sharing about your project. Next up, we have
Thank you so
Karthik.
much.
Thank you too.
So Karthik, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. So, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah. So, I'm currently doing my PhD. I'm Karthik. I'm currently doing my PhD at the School of Creative Media, City University of Hong Kong. And my work concerns looking at how time in games has been studied, and I'm particularly interested in the idea of agency. So I'll present some of the ideas that I have been working on, and also some design experiments, small games that I've been developing to understand this phenomena. Okay, my larger question is, I'm interested in asking how games engage with contemporary temporal conditions, because I think that games always had been interested in playing with time right from the beginning, and I'm interested how they do it currently in the contemporary sense. And in that sense, how they shape the temporal agency, and how minimalist small games can be designed for this. That's the presentation that I'll be doing. And I'm using the idea of temporal agency to refer players' ability to alter, navigate, or manipulate time within the game world, and also to make meaningful choices and see their consequences. So this idea was developed in this paper, the study on temporal agency, and we developed 4 typologies of playing with time play, that this was called. And it looked at games with time loops, time manipulation mechanics, and things like that. And it identified 4 different types of time play, and 2 of them, adaptive and strategic, where more of the agency was of mastery or control over the time. But there were this other type of games that had, by repeating the play, you could have an ethical considerations about the choices that is made, but also there were reflective time play that helps you to reflect back on the larger than outside the game itself. So this kind of showed a progression, like a change from thinking of agency as master-oriented to agency as an endurance within the temporal conditions. So that became a kind of idea that I was interested in. And I kind of came up with 3 different materials that I was looking for to design my games. One was through this study, and also through other studies that were based on how survival games represent time as a decay or an entropic time. So through this, I had these three different design materials: repetition, decay, and memory. And there was this game question. The design question was how minimal games can make these temporal conditions like precarity, displacement, or systemic control playable without reducing them to mastery. This was my larger question. So in this first game that I was looking at how death can become a playable repetitive loop. So the player plays as a soul that is just disembodied from the body, but in its last loop. So there are several different loops, like very small, short 20, 30-second loops. And during this time, the player kind of goes back to the fragments of memories from the past. And along the loops, fragments slowly gets reconstructed. And I was more interested in how this individual mortality can be entangled with a systemic condition, like a larger infrastructural condition. So the idea was how to scale the memory fragments from intimate objects, like suitcase, photograph, etc., towards an infrastructural case, like setting borders or submerged homes, where death becomes both personal loss and also a systemic condition. So this design evolved through three different phases. In the initial phase, it was more like an instrumental design where I had rewind, pause mechanics, time was a resource to be collected and used, and it was metrics driven. And with several playtesting, I realized I had to remove all these, and then I had more simpler kind of ethical questions like, do you want to remember the memory or let go of the memory? And also remove the timers and pause, rewind mechanics and everything. And later, the design evolved more into the memory as an emerging phenomena rather than given at an initial instance and then asked to perform some questions. So these were different stages that involved, but it was not a planned stages. It was like when I retrospectively look at my design journaling and I find this. So through this, I understood that I was working across 5 different layers to design all these things. One is the temporal layer where the repetition and the loops, the small loops were getting designed. And the narrative layer where the memory or the text fragments itself was emerging, starting with the smaller, like local scale to the larger infrastructural scale. And the interactive layer where players were interacting with these memory fragments in different ways by making different choices. And in the agency layer, I was looking at how agency can be, like the control can be larger when the objects were more intimate. And as the scale grew into an infrastructural scale, how the agency can be reduced or the control can be reduced. And in the systemic layer, how these different interactions, the fragments that were interacting, can be the patterns that were emerging for the player can be showcased in the title screens between these loops. So this was the kind of 5 different layers that I was working on. And largely the playtesting revealed that there were 2 limits in the design of this game. One was there was a lack of embodiment, and there was a lack of challenge for the player because the engagement with the memories had no consequences and it was choice-based. So from there, from this limitations and also through this understanding of how different layers that I was working for these games, I went on designing 2 more games. And this game is called Status Pending, and it looks at to how the fluctuating conditions of legality or stability as a temporal condition can be foregrounded in a text platformer. So the player plays like a newly moved migrant into a city and has to make work permit, residence contract, bank account, find a job and things like that. And everything is tied to one thing and the other, and the conditions are constantly shifting. And I use this idea of text itself as a deforming platform for the player to move on, and the player is just a cursor that keeps jumping from one thing to the other. And each loop is like a day and nothing gets completed because everything is changing and shifting and everything is interrelated. So trying to see how this kind of a precarity that is an infrastructural thing as a temporal condition and how it can be implemented in a small game where the administration itself becomes a loop that is never ending and keeps going. And in the next design, I was looking into this idea of how we are constantly having this micro interactions with the digital interfaces that we are interacting with, and that produces a different kind of a temporal experience, which is like a really micro temporal experience. And this micro behavioral thing is visible in the recaptcha that we always sign in with. I'm not a robot, and it detects that we are not a bot because how we move the mouse and things like that. So I wanted to foreground this idea of this microtemporal interactions into a small game, making player to consciously make these small movements and trace different things. And based on this, the cursor, timing, hesitation, rhythm, everything is collected, and a prediction model of the mental and physical condition of the person is kind of given as a prediction to the player. Also, on the underlying factor is that these micro movement can be used as a data collected for bots to learn, so that the bots can perform these micro movements, which is exactly what is the gap that is between bots and the human. So yeah, so these are different kind of temporal experiences, from micro experience to the larger scale experience. I was designing different games, and through this I have a much more kind of a reframed understanding of temporal agency. The initial study understood temporal agency as a kind of subset of larger player agency. Now I'm thinking more as a reframed idea of just player agency itself, and where the agency is not defined by what players can do, but the kind of temporal conditions they must operate within, and how players are positioned within and negotiate these temporal systems. And this reframing allows the games to model lived conditions like precarity or instability, rather than treating time as a neutral mechanic. And these minimal designs really were helpful to isolate these temporal structures and make these repetitions or instability or prediction legible. That's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, we have definitely some time for some questions.
Time.
We do have some time, yes, of various types, yes. Questions pop in. Okay, so then I'll start us off with a question. So I'm a bit curious. You said that you did some play tests with these different games.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm often interested in, and I'm very interested in this context, did your players have any ways of engaging with time that surprised you as the designer, that you didn't think they would conceptualize or approach your game in that way, and thus they had an emergent kind of discovery of what the game meant to them?
Okay, I think my playtesting had been very informal and very limited. I don't think I have gone to the next level of playtesting. I'm still in the design phase, trying to work out for myself, see how these things are. So playtesting, I think I'm interested in seeing how these things work. But also, I also observe that people do not look at time like that in games. Until maybe provoked to ask a question of what they think about time, I don't think.
Okay, so you think it's like a neutral for them, like it just kind of disappears in a assumed background?
It's not neutral, but I think it is more intertwined into multiple things. That's what I realized after designing, because even the design needs to work through different layers that I was talking about. So it is kind of integrated until unless there is a time manipulation, like a pause or rewind or something like that, that consciously uses the mechanic of using the time. The time itself is not understood separately. For instance, I was working at looking at these survival games, and for me, the games have time very evidently as a decaying mechanic. But I don't think that is a normal kind of an observation.
Cool. All right, we have a question online from Carolyn. How did you move from your concept of time to a specific design?
Like I said, I'm more interested in thinking of time from a contemporary experience perspective. So I'm looking at how some of these experiences, that is what is happening, and how I'm understanding it as a temporal condition. And from there, I think, for instance, death was one thing that I initially started with because I was looking at a lot of things that was happening, and it was striking for me. And also just for applying for any kind of documentation process, going through visa and things like that, as I felt that it is really a condition, like a bureaucratic repetition that we all experience. And also this, basically from my own experience, that I think, okay, this can become a design component.
Let's see. Question?
Maybe.
Urgent question.
I can. Hey, I'm Kari. I study at media studies here at Tampere University. I don't know if this is yet a question. I first have to muse through a bit, more of like a pondering and things, because because I'm researching hate speech, and I know that like temporality and pace and like how fast people write things is also part of the problem in like our phenomenon that I'm studying. So in a sense, I'm thinking about the gaming industry and like what kind of affective results emerge from certain types of pace or time, or the feeling of being rushed into making decisions. So I think there's a question there somewhere, but I just don't know how to phrase it yet. Maybe, but like, yeah. So, like, did you study or think of these things in your games? And,
yeah, definitely. I think this is something I come across, like, looking at not just judging others, but also myself when I look at it, like post or things, and I also make hasty judgments based on the conversations people have. And it is definitely a condition for today too. I think I'm more interested in how games have been dealing with these kind of temporal conditions. That is my larger thing. And I don't know if maybe this thing is, I have not come across. Maybe there is one game called, not sure, like it is a broadcast game where you work as a broadcaster and you have to edit videos and things like that deals with something like this.
So another question, I see like in your games, there's for me a little bit of there's an implicit aesthetic, and you bring it up, minimalism, this kind of very formalistic kind of thing. Did you is this a background of games that you also have played a lot, that you have experience with, or that you have like an inspiration or a discourse that you would put yourself inside of like other types of games that have similar approaches to presenting themes?
Maybe it's personally because I am into designing such kind of interfaces, let's say that way. Other inspiration for me was not like long back was the Mole Industria games, which has this kind of very flat, simple presentation. I think they could be one inspiration for me. Web-based 2D interfaces.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself into the world of arts with your games? Because Mole Industria certainly uses that kind of frame sometimes.
Yeah, I have a bit of art background before coming, so I was practicing and making art. So that's
so yes,
okay for me. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. All right, more questions from me. I'm very happy about. So could you talk a little bit more about the data that you're trying to collect with the research of this? Is this like a research through design process where you're hoping to finish with the game and then the process of getting there is the kind of contribution? or is there other access points of information that you're trying to get from the current study?
Right now, it's a research through design. I'm doing design journaling. I use the GitHub as my journal way. Whenever I push the thing, I try to write something. That is one way of looking at it. But I'm definitely more interested in playtesting, because even the first game, I think it evolved into different phases for me because of playtesting. And I have not done more playtesting. So I think next step for me would be doing some more playtesting and see either these designs can evolve or I can get more ideas for the new designs. So, yeah.
Kai, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much. Looking at your games, especially the Death in Memory game and the text platformer game, I was asking myself, are your games really, and that's maybe a tricky question, are they about temporality or are they about linearity?
Ooh.
Why do you think? Because the structure of like linear moving structure, you think it's about linearity?
The structure and the fact that it seemed to me in looking at the platform that you have to repeatedly do the same things one after another, so that you create something like an action chain. And so I asked myself, where is the temporal agency here, or is it something of an acting a linear structure that is preconcepted?
So you would think, I mean, I'm just trying to think through what you're saying. Do you think branching mechanics would allow the linearity to be broken? Is that?
I think the whole discussion about linearity or non-linearity, starting when Aspen made his PhD in the 1990s, it's a little bit boring. But the question came to my mind when I saw your games, and I think it depends on your notion of agency. I wrote my PhD about agency and about the dependencies of the situations and the situatedness in which agency can unfold. And so maybe I said it's a tricky question. I'm of course biased in my perspective on the games, but I think it's a little bit it's a very interesting notion, because linearity in the game is in your games constituted by the combination of temporality and spatiality, and how to negotiate between the two different aesthetic categories. But of course it's a very tricky question.
Yeah, I'm also trying to think what do I even call as agency here, because clearly there is a linearity, like you're saying, there is no agency in that sense. You don't have any other option, but you have to go through certain linear pathway. Yeah, but I think I'm framing it or trying to frame it that way because maybe I'm feeling there is a very limited agency for me right now.
But a lack of agency is also very interesting from my point of view, especially if you are observing players and you could realize that they will go back. They will not follow the linearity. They will try to go back. And so it could be very interesting from the perspective of media usage.
I think that's why I need to go for playtesting and see how people.
All right. Thank you very much, Karthik. That's all of our time. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Carolyn, whenever you're ready.
You are still muted.
Carolyn, you're, yes, muted at the moment.
Is this in presentation mode, or can you see the
We can see the side.
Okay, let me just out of that and try and do it again. How about now?
We don't see your screen at the moment.
Oh. Okay. Sorry.
No worries.
Oh, so I don't quite know how to get out of this loop I'm stuck in.
Are you, your screen isn't shared at the moment. Are you in like some Zoom section?
I think the problem is when I share, when I do full screen, I then can't share my screen. That makes any sense whatsoever.
If you share first and then you go into full screen mode, we should see the full screen.
Sorry. Right. Interesting.
Okay. Perfect. So now if you go into presentation, we should now be able to see it. So if you now go to slideshow and present slideshow, I think that should work. But of course, we also have surprises every time.
Yeah,
so
technicality is always an issue.
It's our favorite speaker every time, the technical issues. Okay, perfect. And if you go, from the beginning.
It's very slow. Sorry about this.
No worries. It's very hard to be a computer. That's what I've learned.
So it's almost there. So this is a good time to start thinking about time, right? This pause,
this
interruption to our schedule.
There you go.
Because this is basically the theme of the talk anyway, is timelines. I found the previous talk really, really interesting on this. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is an ethnography that I did of a video game studio, a studio that called itself indie and that prided itself on being kind of art driven and not corporate and not primarily commercial. It was unusual in that it did in fact do very well financially, and I spent some time there, most part of a year. When I started the study, my first day in the studio was in February 2018, and on the left-hand side here, you can see what was happening at my university at the time. We were in the middle of a strike over pensions, and I don't know if anybody here has ever been on strike or is a member of a union, but it's an incredibly strange experience where you go to work in order not to work, and you put an awful lot of time and effort, but you're not paid. And in the UK, most universities probably go on strike once a year, and they have done for quite a long time. There's quite a lot of industrial action. This particular strike was an extraordinary experience in feeling time very differently, and particularly an experience of reclaiming time over our own work. The picture on the right is a picture from a strike a few years later, which was much less successful. And there's I think some really interesting points here about trade unionization, which I'm going to try and bring up, around what unions can and should ask for, like why go on strike, why stop working, why interrupt work schedules in order to carry on working. And some ways, sometimes it can work really well, and other times it can be an experience in complete demoralization. So when I started this study, I was also my first and one only sabbatical. Again, I don't know if anybody here has ever had a sabbatical. Again, it's a very strange temporal experience. I'm putting this up partly to invite you to reflect on your own experience of doing research, or kind of your own experience of being paid and working, or not being paid and still working, or not working and being paid. So being on sabbatical is, and in the academic world, is meant to be your own time. These are various images that I got from Google about what a sabbatical is. And you can see there's a kind of contrast between work and your own time. So the sabbatical makes very clear that most of the time your time is not your own, it's your employer, and you are paid for that time. And a sabbatical is some kind of gesture of return. And then what you're meant to do with that, obviously, is a very open question. But if you have been on sabbatical, you know, again, it is quite a strange experience of time, of like reclaiming time as your own. It doesn't involve, unfortunately, a lot of sunbathing, I found, but I will come back to that. So at the start of my sabbatical, I found this fantastic game studio just down the road from where I live, and it was financially secure. It was a very interesting place because the people starting there, the people working there had started out quite often as young teenagers making games in their spare time, in their free time, in their non-school time, working at night, on school breaks, at weekends, doing a lot of modding, finding each other on internet relay chats. And over many years, they created a game which freakishly turned out to be phenomenally successful commercially. And this group of teenagers then set up a company, and quite a few of the original people left as millionaires. And then other people were brought in, but it had this kind of ethic, this culture that headed in these two directions. One, making games as a kind of hobby, as an exercise in leisure, as something you do freely, completely independently of money. And at the same time, it was now a company that had to pay salaries, that had to come up with HR policies, that had growth projections, that had all sorts of responsibilities that you have as an employer. And it made for a very kind of distinctive experience of time, an experience which I think has been the subject of quite a lot of the literature on the creative industries, and how, on the one hand, creative industries are characterized by very passionate work, and on the other also by being paid, because so many people are now doing some kind of vague form of creative work and gig work and working for themselves. So it's both paid and unpaid, passionate, and potentially exploitative. So in the literature about games, at the time, I'm not sure if it's changed hugely. I haven't necessarily stayed up to date with it. The way in which the games industry is described, or the game sector, is often in terms of exploitation. So most of the research literature that I know of on the games industry points to how incredibly exploitative, that it pays people for far less of the time than is required to actually make a game. There's a whole literature on crunch and lots of press release on that. And on the other hand, there's also obviously the whole indie sector, where on the whole, people are represented as victims of their own passions and exploiting themselves, kind of working phenomenal hours just to do the work, the game that they want to make for their own pleasure. At the time, again, of my research, there was quite a lot of there were quite a few calls in the press around the need to have unionization in the games industry. So the headline on the top right corner there is from the New York Times, and it was by Jason Schreier, who's written a lot about games. You probably know him. And his argument was that the games industry really needed to unionize because there was just far too prevalent a pattern of exploiting people before a game was released and then firing them, pretty much immediately after it was released. So it was a very negative image of game making as work. And I didn't disagree with any of these images, I had no basis to, but I was quite interested in finding out what other forms of temporal experiences game workers had, more routine, more everyday, and potentially try and understand the trade-offs, because obviously a lot of people in the games industry don't leave the games industry despite these horrific working conditions. They kind of stay in them. And there are no doubt many pleasures to working in games, and there are choices that people are making about what pleasures are more important than others. I was also interested in moving away from this binary of either exploitation or self-exploitation and thinking about how there are different experiences of time in the same place. Maybe going back to Karthik's point around bureaucratic time. So there are, time is as a phenomenological experience is structured very differently depending on all sorts of things. And one of those things might be desire. So rather than urgency or duration, like crunch, for instance, or time it takes to develop, the many years it takes to develop, say, Assassin's Creed, that temporal experience is produced in relation to a desire, in relation to identifying a point of identification about what is desirable. Which you can summarize in terms of, whose clock are you on when you feel urgent, when you feel that your time is kind of pressed or not pressed? And is it possible to have an experience of time where there is no clock at all? In the academic literature, I started reading quite a lot around experience of time. And again, I don't know if this relates back to your interest, Karthik, around time and governmentality and historical shifts in time, but Adorno has written a wonderful essay on free time, which he contrasts to freedom and also to leisure, with free time as the necessary opposite to wage slavery, to work time. So the only reason people go camping or sunbathing is because they need to recover from the exploitative conditions of modern industrial work. Nobody would go camping if just as an expression of freedom. It's simply a continuation of conditions of exploitation. It's a very funny essay. But what he's, whilst it's kind of easy to find the humor in it now, in some ways, if you like camping, I think he points to a really interesting question, which is, what is freedom as a genuine temporal experience? What is it to experience time as something not counted, not subject to economic logic, not something that is simply a mode of recovery in order to be able to go back to work the next day? And it also isn't simply emptying your mind, being completely vacuous on a sun lounger. So one of the areas of work that I drew on was Deleuze, who has this structure that he uses to distinguish between different historical ages. And one is called disciplinary societies, and another is called societies of control. And you might say that disciplinary societies maybe relates to kind of the beginning of systematic social organization, and it's so discipline comes from Foucault's notion of discipline. So it's the beginning of social organization. So in disciplinary societies, time is experienced in relation to norms that you identify with as a member of a particular community. So the clock is your own. So in academic work, you might say you feel such several distinctions in the time it takes to do a PhD. There isn't a fixed time in which to do a PhD or fixed time in which to publish an article, or often not a fixed time for an academic conference. These things are rituals for marking the passage of time within a community to which one belongs. And what I found interesting about this particular concept of disciplinary societies is it seemed to relate very closely to how the indie studio felt it used to make games. So it used to make games as a form of living. People worked all the time, but not worked. People made games all the time because they were making it as part of a community of game makers and game players. They had crowdfunding. They published their game every night and had players play it. So the game was playable by their players as it emerged. It wasn't necessarily that comprehensible to anyone who hadn't followed its development. Everybody did scripting, coding, art assets, sound design, acting. There was no, so it was very much a kind of a communal enterprise. And it was totally overwhelming in that respect. There was absolutely no space for any non-work time. Which is one of the reasons why, for instance, the studio then brought in something called project management, which was completely anathema when they started. And that is when you organize time, according to an optimized schedule, and you impose rules from outside. And that comes quite close to how Deleuze conceptualizes societies of control. So the idea is that you have an outsider, you have a clock which sets the time according to which something will be developed. So, for instance, we have 10 minutes to do these presentations. That's an external clock. It's imposed. It's not related to the content. It has to be met. It's something that warrants being paid, that warrants being recognized in economic terms. So you're using time. You're not wasting it. It's subject to a division of labor. In the games company, it's the point at which it was even possible to conceptualize of anything like profit. And also the difference between making a game and having a market that was external, that wasn't part of the making process, became tangible. And that in Deleuze's work, these temporal orders are kind of very significant historical shifts. But I think you can also see that he would, in his argument about them, I mean, it's never that easy to interpret Deleuze, but, I think they exist side by side. I think there is an argument in his work that allows for these forms of temporal organization to be seen as existing in parallel. And that was very much the case in the indie studio. They were pulled in these two different directions of being kind of art-driven and money-driven. And these two kind of forms of identification lent themselves to different forms of temporal experience, and very different ideas, very different experiences of urgency and duration. So one of the things that this theorization of temporal orders allows is then you can start thinking about, when does time feel pressured and painful, therefore, and when does it feel pleasurable and possibly unmeasured? And one of the shifts that the employees in the indie studio talked about as both good and bad is the point at which they stopped working on a game as theirs and started working for it as something that had to be finished and that existed totally independent of them as people. And there was similarly other really startling instances, like, if you were working all the time, that could be an experience of fabulous immersion in a way of being together, or it could be the experience of feeling horrendously under pressure because your fans kept telling you that you'd missed various deadlines, and if you didn't meet them, then they were just going to abandon you and leave you with a product that wasn't going to sell and salaries wouldn't be paid. And within this particular temporal order, one of the things that struck me as a middle-aged woman was how everybody thought that being 30 was being really old, and in some ways that the logic for that was precisely because if you're part of a community that starts out when you're 12, and the product you're making is also one that emerges as an experience of childhood and then young adulthood, when you have a whole fan community that makes your game, being 30 is the point at which you start to feel, you know, incredibly defunct and out of date with all of those childhood references that were once shared. It's only so long that you can keep talking about Harry Potter. So there's lots of, yeah, I'm trying to respect vaguely, you know, the timescale that we have. I've no idea how long I've been talking, by the way. But one of the questions that I was left with in playing with these theoretical ideas was what is free time then? So if it's not sunbathing, if it's not camping, if like the whole concept of work-life balance is actually, you know, problematically completely capitalist, then what is it to have freedom as a form of time? And one of my colleagues uses the Deleuzian categories to think about academic time and how how you know, how research kind of evolves as a temporal experience. And she interviewed people who did research, and she found that one of the ways in which they found research pleasurable was precisely as an experience of timelessness. So if any of you enjoy doing academic work, you might find, you know, what is sometimes really enjoyable is that sense of being completely absorbed, including just looking out the window and having thoughts, like you're being really immersed in the book. You know, it doesn't happen necessarily very often, but there is. I'm hoping I'm communicating something which is recognizable, but it's a sense of being kind of taken out of your normal timescales. And that was something that was very, very recognizable in the indie game studio. And it often happened at times which was outside of their standard optimized project management schedule. So it was not at all uncommon for level designers to play around with their level designs at 2 a.m, despite having been told that they absolutely should not be working at that time. Conferences and game events were often kind of occasions on which some of the artists realized that, you know, this is why they made games. It was a sense of being together with the community, and like 4 days would go past standing at a conference, and it was an experience of extraordinary intensity. And similarly, you know, even the kind of accountants and producers and people on the kind of the money side of the business use this wonderful language of being spellbound or kind of captured by the magic of talking about game making. And so there was a really interesting image here, I thought, of like timelines being transgressed, timelessness, of time as an incredibly intense experience, which is neither a case of being exploited or exploiting oneself. I thought maybe that came close. I don't know. So that was the question I was left with: is what is free time? What is genuinely free time? Not the kind of ersatz form that we get at weekends and in the evenings. And also, what form of working time is actually desirable? In the call for unionization of the games industry, what should trade unions be asking for? Should they be asking for more 9-to-5 jobs? I mean, that's not necessarily a bad start, but I guess people I'd met were in the industry precisely because they did not want 9-to-5 jobs. They wanted some experience of complete absorption. And similarly, I would say the same thing applies to academics. And just take us in a radically different direction to finish off with. I became very interested in the whole idea of possibly, you know, completely separating out the relationship between time and money. And so one of the conclusions I reached after hanging out at this studio was there was a very good argument for universal basic income and just, you know, people having money to do whatever they wanted to do with their time.
You're receiving snaps from the room now. Yes. Okay. Very exciting. In the interests of time, maybe we'll move to just a couple of quick questions. We're near the end, but
yet again, the question of quick. I don't know if I can be quick because time is a subject that takes time sometimes to phrase out. But yeah, thank you so much for this talk, and it reminds me of like some very old thoughts I've had, like how in Finland we have a whole different like politics of time because we have this thing called winter here, so we don't want to be too early or too late to the bus stop because then you have to wait in the cold, and that's a question of sickness and health. As is time, like in gaming industry, it's a question of sickness and health. If you work too much, you don't work enough, you like all that. So it's big topic. So yeah, my question is then maybe like, is your research more based on the UK politics of time, or like more of a global view, or some other countries? Did you take into account like other cultures where the politics of time are different, or did you stay in that local type of time, how we see time? Yeah.
Well, that's a fantastic question. I didn't think of it necessarily as UK, but I think the politics of time are completely cultural. And you know, the experience of time in a university is shaped completely by the conditions of funding of university. So one of the reasons we were on strike is because in the UK we've moved to a system of being entirely dependent on student fees and running a university system on a completely commercial basis, and that has completely changed the experience of teaching and of doing research, because it has to be very value driven. And similarly, I think in the game studio, you know, they've moved from a culture of making games as artistic expression to something that would you know, pay for mortgages and childcare and all sorts of things which don't seem particularly important when you're 14. And so the structure within which the games were made, the culture structure that, you know, had many, that's what changed the actual experience of games. I don't think it's so much national as like cultural for that particular sector and that particular economic basis.
Right. Thank you so much. Sadly, that is all of our time for right now. But Caroline, thank you again. Thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your insights and all of these really interesting ways of conceptualizing time. The Games as Art Center is certainly a disciplinary relationship to time. Internally, everyone just does everything. So one final note, if you are one of those art plus game people out there, we are hosting a Games as Art Festival next October that's going to be fully hybrid. So if you know anyone, either these are student games or things like that, who would like to possibly participate in a Finnish art game festival, we think the first ever in the history of Finland, but we don't know yet, but we think. We would love to have you. Thank you again to all of our speakers. And I'll leave the chat open for a little while if you want to ask any questions there, answer anything, or have contacts between each other. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the interesting exchange.